Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's Ag Forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions, your premier platform for real-time global insights. Well, this animation I'm going to play for you here quickly is a look at yesterday from sunup to sundown across the United States from our GOES 16 satellite. And you can see a couple of really interesting things as I kind of rock back and forth here. One, the day-night line here has quite a bit of an angle to it. That's simply due to the fact that we're approaching the winter solstice. Total sunlight hours here in parts of the northerly latitudes of North America are very short, of course, with the days being so short this time of year. But the features I really want you to clue in on here from yesterday. First, we can see the large low pressure system that did kind of hit California. You can see the next one kind of waiting in the wings out here in the open kind of Gulf of Alaska region. We'll talk about that in a few moments. We can see the first system that went through and dumped all that snow in parts of the northeast finally getting off the picture. But you can see this back here, this kind of gray shading, this is the snow that is currently sitting in the northern plains. And you'll notice as I go back and forth that area doesn't move like the rest of the clouds do. That's a good indicator that we're seeing snow sitting in that area. Well, the big question I have to start off is what are temperatures doing in this region specifically over the coming days? Because if there's any chance to melt that snow, there's a lot of water in it. So looking at the snow water equivalent, we see that some parts of the snow pack there stretching from Wyoming, getting all the way over to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, we have as much as 2 inches of liquid equivalent in that snow. So if that melts, that would create a major flooding problem in addition to all the issues that it created with trying to finish the harvest in this area. You can also see there's quite a bit of water in the snowfall that packed up into parts of Pennsylvania, New York, then getting into all of the northeast states with the system that left, with some locations picking up several inches of snowfall there. Meanwhile, out west, our mountains are slowly packing things up with snow, but still there is a pretty sizable deficit in total snowfall inside of this area, whereas getting into the Sierra Nevada, into the central Rockies, and then over here into this area certainly has more snow this time of year than would be average. So knowing that, let's take a look at our soil moisture. I showed this yesterday in the long-range forecast too, just to kind of keep things in perspective. We've been quite dry here in parts of the Pacific Northwest and dry down here along the kind of Gulf Coast states. Very, very wet in the north central plains getting into the middle and lower Mississippi River Valley. And the main focus of this video is, are we expecting to see change in any of these regions? And what are our temperature patterns going to be doing to kind of support that change? Because over the last 72 hours, where did we put down the precipitation? So this is the last 3 days here. We can see it was primarily with that system that came on shore here in California and parts of the Sacramento Valley able to put down almost 3 inches of precipitation just in the last 72 hours. And like we've been discussing, the midsection of the country was going into a drier time period, as was our southern region. So when are things changing and what does that change look like? Well, it starts with the discussion in the upper levels of the atmosphere. In the near term, the major features to be watching, of course, we can see the deeper cutoff low that's sitting here and spinning off the coast. We're going to talk about where that goes in the next 3 to 5 days. This is a little shortwave that's going to move out of the Rocky Mountains later today, cutting across the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas, such that by the weekend it does bring in some precipitation here to the lower Mississippi River Valley. And we do have this little jet streak in through here that brings a clipper that runs right here along the northern part of the U.S., that right there on the U.S.-Canadian border. But the feature, the area, the part of the atmosphere that I think is going to be the most telling on our temperature patterns coming up will actually be seeing the development of what the upper level flow pattern does right in this area. So that's going to be a key focal point here, and what that is doing in connection with the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, specifically over to the Aleutian Islands. So pay close attention today when I'm talking about those particular regions, because they are going to be the main indicators on how the flow is going to be setting up. So let's get to the near term first. Just looking at our next 4 days here, just so this gets us through the weekend, we can see where we're adding additional precipitation. Clipper sneaks in through here. We'll talk about some more snowfall that will get downwind of the Great Lakes. And then we have that little shorewave that's moving through the mountains today, packing up some snow there in the Rockies, but then it ejects and gets right in through this corridor. Greatest chance at precipitation here toward the end of the weekend, or the middle and end of the weekend, of picking up maybe a half inch or more of rainfall, kind of tucked away down there in Arkansas to Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama. All right. Meanwhile, California still has, with that deeper coastal low, remember it was sitting here, we're still bringing that flow out of the southwest and adding quite a bit more rainfall to the northern part of California, where we may be seeing some locations pick up between 2 and 4 inches of additional precipitation. But that's the wrong trajectory to bring in a lot of rainfall or snow here to the Pacific Northwest here in the near term. And speaking of snow, this is what we're anticipating here. This is the operational European model run. So the Sierra Nevada going to continue to add to their recent surplus, but over the next 4 days, snowfall amounts in the west remain relatively light compared to what they can be for this time of year. But much of the rest of the United States snow-free in terms of additional snow through the next 4 days. Now, we do see that clipper that comes through bringing in some more snow here to parts of Michigan, but then getting over into New York and into New Hampshire and Vermont, and maybe possibly some coming in here with some of the colder air in parts of the Appalachian Mountains. But the big question is there anything changing this pattern such that we're going to get enough cold air that we could get some snow spreading across a wider region? So here's what I'm going to be watching most carefully. This map over here on the left is day 4 through 10. So this is going to start at the end of the weekend and go through all of next week from the GFS ensemble. On the right is the European. Both models are in very good agreement about the pattern that is setting up, and it features kind of two things. You see, this is that northern push in the polar jet stream kind of pushing in that direction, and the subtropical jet squeezing in like this. And both models are painting basically central Texas all the way along the East Coast, very, very wet into next week. And what's most important here is we're going to see this first system develop in this region on Monday, Tuesday, and push on off to the north and east. Bitterly cold air that pushes in behind it, and that's going to set up this kind of, frontal zone that sits right in through here. And given the instability we get in the atmosphere with having the warm water sitting here over the Gulf of Mexico and along the Gulf Stream, we need to be watching right into this area next week, end of next week, for the development of a low that then runs up the East Coast. Now, why I'm so concerned about this is that if the GFS has the forecast right, there will be so much cold air tucked into the back of this, we could be looking at a significant snow event. And I'm talking about this system coming through at the end of next week. The European is a bit more relaxed in that colder pattern, and I need to show you why the differences are there. But both models have a low coming out of this area racing up here, and we should take a look at what it looks like. I'm going to show you first the European model. And we're going to start this off Thursday morning at 6 a.m. and play this forward. And so it plays it pretty quickly here, but you'll notice the two systems we're talking about. First one comes out here Thursday night, gets all the way developing a low here and the border of kind of along the Red River here of Oklahoma and Texas. And then it just produces some light rain on Friday to kind of start off our weekend here that moves through parts of the lower and mid-Mississippi River Valley. Meanwhile, out ahead of it, that clipper snuck through here, went right over the Great Lakes, and this is where we're bringing in the potential for snow. Behind that, we do notice a higher atmospheric pressure that does build in and pushes right here over the eastern Corn Belt, while that deeper upper level low you saw earlier kind of pushes into California finally. So at this point, still much of our weekend for the midsection of the country is relatively boring in terms of weather. What we do get is high pressure cells sitting over the east allows for some warm air advection. That's warm air coming out of the south on this pressure gradient tucked in through here. Meanwhile, this end of this week, that low is causing quite a bit of precipitation in the west. And as it comes through here, well, this is where things get interesting for the eastern third of the United States. So we've been discussing all week long about the development of kind of an elongated area of lower pressure sitting in here by Monday morning, getting into Monday afternoon. We can still see it in place in that area. Cold enough here on the backside, getting some snow in Minnesota, Wisconsin, but you can see the broad feed of moisture around this high. There's a big high over here, and look, it's just pumping the moisture all along the East Coast and just pushing it into the midsection of the United States, well, the eastern half of the United States, giving us all the moisture we need to make this rainfall. So that system comes through. This is now Tuesday morning, so you can still see it, a broad area here as the jet stream widely swoops in like this, anchored on its cold being up here in the Canadian prairies. And this is where things do get very cold. Tuesday morning into Wednesday morning, as this high pressure cell comes in, it's bringing in some cold air like we saw with some of the big cold air outbreaks back in November. And with it, lake effect snow on one side. And what I'm most concerned about, and I'll show you the European model solution for this is next Thursday morning, getting into next Friday morning. At this point, with that big blast of Arctic air moving in, we will be producing what we call a baroclinic zone right here along the coast, on which low pressure could easily develop. And the European model takes it right out of the Gulf Coast, see it there? And then yanks it right up the East Coast. Now, the difference in the solution between the European and the GFS is quite stark out at this time period, but we're way out here in the forecast. The GFS has a much more developed low that comes out of basically eastern Texas and races up through this area with big snow that'll be on the backside of this as it goes forward. So too much model uncertainty to pin this one down. I want you to all know that I'm going to watch it very carefully. And we're talking again about next Friday, Saturday time period. So this is the 13th and the 14th, okay? So let's talk about the temperatures that have to come in terms of bringing in the colder weather to make that happen. So let's take a look at morning low temperatures here. This is for the day on Thursday. We can still see a lot of teens here and low 20s in the upper plains, and that's going to change dramatically in the coming days. So let's just take a look at Friday morning's lows. So they're right here, single digit up in this area. Getting into Saturday, Sunday. So some moderation out ahead of that big system that develops there. To see all the warmth that's out ahead of that system that comes through on Monday. But as I said, it was next Tuesday, really Monday into Tuesday, that the coldest air, maybe some of the coldest air of the year so far, comes in to the north central plains. And there we see that by next Tuesday morning, we're looking at low temperatures that'll be in the negative single digits all the way up past -10. And that invades here by Tuesday morning into Wednesday morning in north central plains. So how long does that cold air stick around? Because this would be the colder air that if it sticks around long enough and penetrates far enough to the south, we could get a system that comes out of the Texas, Louisiana region and races up the coast with enough cold air on the backside to be producing some snow. But again, I'm talking about next Thursday, Friday, Saturday to watch for that setup. So let's take a look at what it does here in the upper levels of the atmosphere to understand it. As we always do, GFS ensemble is over here on the left, European is over here on the right. As we play this forward, let's just watch the main pieces we've been discussing. Here comes a little shortwave toward the end of the week, right in through there, comes in and brings our rainfall to the southern Mississippi River Valley. Okay. Meanwhile, the little clipper sneaks right here through parts of the Great Lakes toward the end of the week. This is what gives us the downwind snows here on the Great Lakes and some snow in the northeast. Meanwhile, big push out west with this deep trough that finally makes it on shore for the weekend, bringing the widespread precipitation for the western United States. In the midsection of the country, before the next low shows up on Monday, a rebound in our temperatures. You can see it right in through here. And as we play this forward, let's see where that trough it gets to by the time we get to Monday morning. So this is when things get very active next week. So far, good model agreement here. Notice that both models have kind of been well synchronized at this point. The changes begin right here. On Monday, the development of the low happens outside or out ahead of this trough. And as that trough sweeps through, I want you to see the difference between the GFS on the left and the European on the right. You see, the European on the right takes this trough and more quickly lifts it toward Greenland, and it's being pulled along by this bigger ridge sitting in this area. The GFS shoves a much larger ridge into Alaska. That brings more cold air back farther to the west and allows this trough to linger a bit longer. So what does that mean? Well, see, the Europeans taken it and shoved it all the way up here between Hudson Bay and Greenland by the time we get to next Friday. And that allows for a quick rebound in the warmth, whereas the GFS says, nope, we're going to keep this in place here, allowing the colder air to stick around, pushing it pretty far to the south here by the time that next system could take shape right in this area. And we can see that difference here is quite substantial. Now the cold air fully anchored here between Hudson Bay and Greenland, stretching all the way down to the Baja. See it right there? Whereas the European model separates the two systems. All the cold air pinched off here, ridging builds back in, and this secondary trough, which is the one that builds that system that we saw at the end of next week, does not have the depth of colder air that the GFS does. See how it's connected? See how it's disconnected over here in the European? This one is very wet, but it is not bringing in the big snow, whereas the GFS, the much more linked colder air, bringing in the big snow on this system that's going to come through. Again, I'm way out here. This is the end of next week. So then the pattern beyond this is quite different from both models. And a lot of this has to do with changes happening in the Pacific and also those changes happening in the stratosphere with the polar vortex, looking out much beyond middle of the month here, okay? So looking at that 6 to 10 day time period, both models agree that there is some very, very cold air that is moving in behind the system that sneaks through on Monday and setting up shop here for multiple days. The difference is the European model moves that colder air more quickly on off to the north and east by the time we get to the 11 to 15 day time period, and the GFS locks it in place here. And that is the big difference maker between our two models at this point, and we saw that. It's all about the linking together of the troughs along the eastern half of North America. The GFS favoring a more broad trough linked up with colder air sitting here over Greenland, and the European bringing in a broader ridge to pinch that off, and as we see here, much less extreme temperature anomalies as a result. So that is the main pieces that are coming together as we squeeze through the middle and end of this month, all right? Now, normally when we see bitterly cold air that sets up along the east and it's sustained, we see that the North Atlantic oscillation goes negative for a while. And right now the forecasts are to keep the North Atlantic oscillation both in the ECMWF, the European model, and in the GFS on the positive side of things. And why that's significant is if you just go back and you look at the coldest Decembers we've had for our eastern region, because that's really where the coldest air is coming into, right? It's coming out of the Canadian prairies and then coming right here to the eastern half of the country. Well, generally when that happens, we get a dominant, what we call negative North Atlantic oscillation pattern. Not what we have right now, but typically a much deeper trough that sits off the northeast and a big ridge that sits over Greenland. Also at that time, a big ridge that sits over Alaska. I told you, those are the two areas that we're going to have to link up here in this video. So why I don't see this cold as sustained for multiple days as we get into the middle and end of this month is because we don't have the negative NAO setup. It is certainly going to be around from next Tuesday all the way through the end of next week. But I think things are dominated more right now by the the upstream flow in the North Pacific than I do think that they're controlled by the downstream flow in the North Atlantic. All right, that's my kind of analysis of that cold pattern. So, yep, it comes in, but how long does it last? It's not too terribly long. This is the upstream events that I'm talking about. We still have the Indian Ocean dipole event fading. Warm air in the North Pacific and warm water with it there. You can see that. And the biggest unknown is what's happening over here in our El Nino region, because we've seen recently some warming up of the waters here, but you can still see some colder water that is still tucked away in place. And it's a very difficult year to diagnose what's going to be happening in that El Nino region, which is critical to our winter as it sets up the strength and position of the subtropical jet stream. So what are we watching? The same story continues. The Indian Ocean dipole is fading. So in the near term, yeah, we still have the strong subsidence over Australia and Indonesia. But as we get out here toward the end of the month of December, you can see that this same area is no longer having that strong upper level subsidence. And that's because this Indian Ocean dipole event is fading quickly. Now, we do have favorable conditions over the next 10 days here. See the upper level support sitting over South America. But as this Indian Ocean dipole event fades, we're going to have to watch very carefully for what that does to the South American monsoon. So to finish this up, we've seen this pattern set up and it's going to continue. Where's our wettest conditions coming out of the Amazon, through parts of Mato Grosso, into Mato Grosso do Sul, and over toward Paraná. It is drier than average in the forecast here in Brazil's eastern regions, and it's also drier than average getting into Argentina's growing areas, specifically the northern, western, and southern side of their growing area. Now, when we just take a look back at Brazil, thinking about the progress of their planting of soybeans, which is nearly done, they recently, at the end of November and the beginning of December, had some very favorable rainfall. Over the last 60 days, though, there is still overall a deficit, which you can see here. Normal is there, the deficit is below. And that time period here in second and third week of November here, where there wasn't much precipitation, is what is kind of critical to the early vegetative stages of these beans. So we're going to watch it very carefully, but your next 15-day forecast is, I think, shown quite well here in the European model over there on the right. The GFS echoes this. It's just a little bit wetter in through this area than the European is at this time. So we're going to keep a close eye on the transition here as we get through the end of December, watching the Indian Ocean dipole event fade, and what that means for letting the Matt-Julian oscillation take over as the dominant driver, I think, in the position and strength of the Brazilian monsoon. So I'll keep you updated. That's why we keep producing these videos every day. But I want to thank you so much for your attention. Have a great end of your week, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.